We have one more federal question, then we'll go into some election-specific questions. What is your current position on bailing out bankrupt state governments?
Do you know any? I can think of a few. Well, I alluded to that earlier in my remarks about the way South Dakota has chosen to do business as a state year after year after year. And that's balancing our budget and not putting ourselves in a position where we have to rely on outside help. You know, California has an economy that is larger than most of the rest of the nations in the world. And what we've learned from the California example is that high taxes and high services are not the keys to economic prosperity. South Dakota is a low-tax, low-service state. But when you compare our people, person to person, South Dakota to California, you'll find that in general we're happier and we have more of our needs met than our counterparts over on the West Coast. There are many states that are going to need some help. And we're going to have to find solutions that allow them to climb out of the hole that they've dug for themselves. Some of them will borrow money from other places and sources. Some of them will bond for it. Some of them, unfortunately, are going to raise taxes on their citizens instead of cutting and controlling the size of their government. But I certainly do not support the so-called stimulus package. It did very little to stimulate the economy. What it did, in fact, was grow state governments and grow the federal government. And that was not the solution that the country was looking for. We should have been looking for ways to put people back to work so that we can start a more rapid and increased acceleration to grow ourselves out of the economic challenge that we continue to find ourselves in. So it's a very delicate situation. There will be multiple answers, and they will vary state by state.
No, I would not support bailing out states that have found themselves in financial difficulty for a couple of reasons. First of all, realizing that the federal government is spending $1.5 trillion more a year than it takes in, the federal government simply does not have the resources to bail out state governments any longer. Any dollar the federal government takes to pass on to state government to bail out their problems is a dollar that we, the federal government, is borrowing. And so you're simply trading one borrowed dollar for another borrowed dollar, and that doesn't make sense. The second reason is the states that have found themselves in difficulties, certainly the economy is part of that, but it also comes down to decision-making at the state level. Decisions that were made in their tax structures, and in their spending structures, and in their service structures for their people are decisions that they've made. And for them to then turn around and say, well, we want the taxpayers of South Dakota as federal taxpayers to help bail us out for that, that doesn't make sense to me. So I would not be supportive of that.
No, I would not be supportive of bailouts for state governments that did not find the opportunity to balance their own state budgets. I think the best solution to this, what the federal government should be doing, is making sure they're not continuing to sentence state governments unfunded mandates, which they're very fond of doing it. They do it through education, through medical services, through Medicaid, through welfare, through unemployment benefits, constantly sending new unfunded mandates down to state governments and telling them to put them into place but not sending them any funds to do that. There's a lot the federal government could do for state governments, though, by removing some of those, by allowing state governments to make more decisions for themselves, what's best for their people, what programs would work best for their people, and giving them more freedoms. Taking some of the regulations off the states that are putting them in such dire straits. When you look at the budget discussions that we had in the legislature the last several years, you know, I've been there for 4 years in the last 2 years as the assistant majority leader on the leadership team. So many of the situations that put us into a tough budget situation were because of unfunded mandates that came to us from the federal government. And I think that that's wrong. I think the federal government needs to understand that the people who make the best decisions for the people in the states are the people who are closest to them, who understand what they need, so that we aren't continuing to pass stimulus packages like passed last year, and now we're putting new windows in homes simply because we can, because the dollars were there in the stimulus package to be spent, when it should have been spent on paying down our debt and on actually giving governments, state governments and families more freedom to make decisions that would allow them to have more personal responsibility and rely on themselves for more solutions.
Since all of you view America as a Christian nation, and each of you have shared your views about separation of